Chapter 1. You might remember a moment where a conversation felt perfectly normal on the surface, yet something about the energy between you and her suddenly shifted in a way you couldn't quite explain. No argument, no obvious tension, just a small comment she made that seemed slightly sharper than usual, followed by a quiet pause while she watched how you reacted to it. At the time, it probably didn't feel like anything important. Most men brush those moments off without thinking about them twice. The conversation moves forward, the evening continues, and life carries on like normal. Yet if you replay that interaction later, something about that pause starts standing out. The way she looked at you, the way the moment felt like it was waiting for something, that waiting is often where the test exists. A lot of men hear the phrase tests and imagine something manipulative. The reality tends to be quieter than that. Most of these moments aren't planned consciously. They happen naturally because human beings pay attention to emotional signals when deciding whether they trust someone. Women do this constantly, often without even realizing it themselves. They watch how a man responds to pressure, to humor, to disagreement, to uncertainty. The reactions reveal things about character that words alone never could. Think about how people evaluate trust in everyday life. You don't usually believe someone simply because they say something positive about themselves. You believe them because their behavior stays consistent when situations become slightly uncomfortable. That's where many of these quiet tests appear. Sometimes it's something as small as teasing you about something harmless just to see how relaxed you remain. The comment might sound playful, almost like a joke, yet the pause afterward reveals that she's watching your reaction more closely than usual. You might remember a moment where a woman said something slightly challenging about you, maybe joking about your confidence or your habits. If you laughed and stayed relaxed, the conversation probably continued smoothly. If you became defensive or tense, the atmosphere likely shifted in ways that were hard to explain in the moment. Those small reactions tell people a lot. Women often learn through experience that confidence isn't about how someone behaves when everything feels easy. It shows itself when something unexpected happens. A joke lands a little sharper than expected. Someone disagrees with you. A comment tests your sense of humor or emotional stability. Your reaction becomes more revealing than anything you said earlier in the conversation. Most men don't realize those moments are happening while they're inside them. They interpret the situation literally rather than emotionally. A teasing comment sounds like criticism. A small disagreement feels like conflict. Meanwhile, the woman is simply watching how you handle a little bit of pressure. You've probably seen this dynamic play out before without labeling it as a test. Maybe a woman challenged you lightly during a conversation and then smiled when you stayed calm. Maybe she seemed slightly surprised when you didn't react the way she expected. Those reactions revealed that something subtle was happening underneath the surface of the interaction. A man once described meeting a woman during a small gathering with mutual friends. Their conversation started easily, full of jokes and casual topics that moved naturally from one subject to another. At some point, she made a comment teasing him about being too confident when he told a story about something he had accomplished recently. The comment sounded playful, yet it carried a slight edge. The man laughed and responded with another joke, turning the moment into something light rather than serious. The conversation kept moving smoothly afterward, and the woman's tone softened noticeably during the rest of the interaction. Later, the man thought about that moment and realized something interesting. The teasing comment had created a small moment of tension. His reaction had determined whether the interaction felt comfortable or awkward afterward. Women often pay attention to those reactions more than men realize, not because they're trying to manipulate the situation, but because they're observing emotional stability. People naturally want to know how someone behaves when things don't go perfectly. You might notice these small tests appearing during conversations where a woman suddenly disagrees with something you said. The disagreement may not even matter much, The topic might be something trivial like music, movies, or opinions about a place you both visited. Still, the way she watches your response can reveal something about what she's paying attention to. If you stay relaxed, the conversation usually flows forward easily. If you become defensive, the atmosphere changes slightly. That shift often happens quietly enough that you might not notice it immediately. Human interactions carry a lot of information beneath the words being spoken. Tone, posture, facial expressions, pauses between sentences. Those details communicate emotional signals constantly. Women tend to read those signals carefully when deciding whether they feel comfortable with someone. You may have experienced moments where a woman seemed more interested in you after you handled a small challenge calmly. Those moments often reveal that she saw something about your personality during the interaction that made her feel more relaxed around you. Confidence often reveals itself through steadiness rather than dominance. If you think back to conversations where someone challenged you lightly and the moment felt surprisingly important afterward, you probably understand the kind of situation being described here. Those moments can shape how someone sees you more than the rest of the conversation combined. And if you've ever had a moment where a small comment from a woman suddenly made you realize she was paying close attention to your reaction, write about it in the comments. A lot of people begin recognizing these patterns once they start remembering interactions that once seemed ordinary at the time. Chapter 2. Sometimes the moment doesn't look like a challenge at all. In fact, it can look like the exact opposite. Everything feels comfortable. The conversation flows easily. She's smiling, asking questions, leaning into the interaction like everything is going perfectly. Then she says something that sounds surprisingly uncertain about you. Not aggressively uncertain, just a small comment that quietly lowers your status in the moment. Something like joking about whether you're actually as confident as you seem, or wondering out loud whether you're really serious about something you just said. And it lands strangely, because the conversation was going so smoothly right before that. Most men react to that moment instinctively. They rush to explain themselves. They try to prove the comment wrong. They begin defending the image they think she's questioning. The moment becomes heavier than it needed to be. You've probably seen this happen in conversations around you before. Someone gets teased or slightly challenged and immediately begins justifying themselves as if something serious just happened. The emotional tone of the interaction shifts because now the conversation revolves around defending something instead of simply continuing naturally. Women often watch those moments carefully. The reason these situations matter so much is because they reveal how grounded someone is in their own identity. When someone feels secure in who they are, small comments don't shake them emotionally. They might laugh. They might respond playfully. They might ignore the challenge entirely because it doesn't feel important enough to react to. That calm response often changes the entire energy of the interaction. When a man becomes defensive, the conversation starts revolving around his need to prove himself. When he remains relaxed, the moment dissolves naturally, and the interaction keeps its original rhythm. You might remember a moment when a woman made a small comment that questioned something about you, and the easiest response would have been to defend yourself immediately. If you stayed calm instead, you probably noticed something interesting happen afterward. Her tone softened. The conversation flowed easier again. The tension that briefly appeared disappeared almost instantly. That shift often reveals that she was observing how you handled a small moment of pressure rather than attacking you personally. Many women test emotional stability without consciously planning to do it. They simply say something slightly challenging and watch how the man reacts. The reaction tells them more about his character than any self-description could. Think about how people evaluate trust in everyday life. Someone can tell you they're confident, patient, calm under pressure. Those words sound nice, but they don't become believable until you see how that person behaves when something unexpected happens. Conversations create small versions of those unexpected moments constantly. A woman might challenge your opinion about something you care about just to see whether you stay composed. She might tease you lightly about something you said earlier to see whether you maintain your sense of humor. The reactions that follow reveal emotional stability in ways words never could. A man once described a conversation he had with a woman during a casual dinner with friends. The evening had been easy, full of jokes and playful conversation. At one point, he mentioned something about a project he had been working on for months. The woman smiled and said something that sounded half teasing and half curious. She asked whether he actually finished things he started, or if he was one of those people who just talked about ideas. The comment caught him slightly off guard. The easiest reaction would have been to defend himself and start listing all the things he had accomplished. Instead, he laughed and said something playful about how she would have to wait and see. The conversation moved forward naturally after that moment. The tone stayed light. The tension that briefly appeared dissolved immediately because he didn't treat the comment as something that required a serious response. He realized the moment had revealed something important about how women observe emotional reactions. The test wasn't about whether his project existed. It was about whether he would remain calm when someone lightly challenged his credibility. Women tend to notice when a man's emotional state changes quickly in response to small comments. Rapid defensiveness can signal insecurity even when the man doesn't intend it to. Calm reactions communicate something different. They suggest that the person feels comfortable enough with themselves that small challenges don't threaten their identity. You might recognize moments where a woman's respect for you seemed to increase after you handled a playful challenge calmly. Those moments often feel subtle while they're happening, yet they influence how someone sees you moving forward. Human attraction tends to respond strongly to emotional steadiness. If you think back to conversations where someone tested your reaction with a teasing comment or a slightly skeptical question, you probably remember how the energy of the interaction changed depending on how you responded. And if you've ever experienced a moment where staying relaxed during a challenge seemed to make a woman look at you differently afterward, share that story in the comments. Many people start noticing how often these small tests appear once they begin recognizing the patterns inside everyday conversations. Chapter 3. Sometimes the test doesn't look like a challenge at all. It shows up as distance. The energy between you and her suddenly cools down a little, and nothing about the conversation explains why. The interaction had been moving easily, maybe even feeling playful and warm, and then something about her tone becomes quieter. Her responses get shorter. The eye contact fades slightly. Most men notice this shift immediately because it feels uncomfortable. You're standing there thinking something must have changed, but you can't identify what it was. The last thing you said didn't seem strange. The conversation topic wasn't serious. Yet suddenly, the rhythm between you both feels different. That moment is where another kind of test often exists. When a woman pulls back slightly during an interaction, she's sometimes observing how a man responds to that emotional shift. The distance isn't always intentional in a calculated way. It's often instinctive. She becomes curious about what happens when the flow of attention between you changes. The reaction she's watching for usually reveals something about confidence and emotional balance. Many men immediately begin chasing the energy that disappeared. They ask if something is wrong. They start trying harder to make her laugh. They begin filling the conversation with extra effort to bring things back to where they were earlier. And that effort often makes the shift feel even more noticeable. You might remember moments where you sensed a woman becoming slightly distant and felt the urge to fix the interaction quickly. That instinct is natural. People want conversations to feel comfortable, and when something changes unexpectedly, the first reaction is often to repair it. But when someone tries too hard to recover the earlier energy, the interaction can start feeling forced. The focus moves from enjoying the moment to managing the tension inside it. Women often watch that moment carefully, not because they want to make the interaction uncomfortable, but because the reaction reveals how emotionally steady the man is when the environment changes. If the man remains calm, the distance often dissolves naturally after a few moments. The conversation finds its rhythm again without anyone needing to force it. If the man becomes visibly uneasy, the interaction can start feeling heavier than it needs to be. The pressure he creates by trying to fix the moment makes the shift more noticeable. You've probably seen this dynamic play out in conversations around you. Someone senses a change in tone and immediately begins trying to recover the earlier atmosphere. The effort itself becomes the most noticeable part of the interaction. Meanwhile, the person who created the distance might have only been curious about how the man handles uncertainty. Human attraction responds strongly to emotional steadiness during unpredictable moments. A woman may pull back slightly, just to see whether a man's energy stays the same, or whether it becomes reactive. If his presence remains calm, the interaction often returns to its earlier comfort naturally. A man once described noticing this during a conversation with a woman he had met at a friend's gathering. Their interaction had been easy for most of the evening. They joked about random things, talked about places they wanted to visit, and shared stories about childhood experiences. At some point, the woman's tone changed slightly. Her responses became shorter, and she stopped leaning toward the conversation the way she had earlier. The man noticed the shift immediately. For a moment, he wondered whether he had said something wrong. Instead of trying to repair the moment, he continued the conversation normally. His tone stayed relaxed, his pace stayed the same, and he didn't ask whether something was wrong. After a few minutes, the woman's energy returned to the way it had been earlier. She started laughing again and leaning into the conversation naturally. Later, he realized that moment had revealed something interesting about how people observe emotional reactions. The brief distance had created a small moment of uncertainty. His reaction to that uncertainty determined whether the interaction felt stable or tense afterward. Women often notice when a man remains grounded, even when the emotional atmosphere changes unexpectedly. That steadiness communicates something about how he handles pressure and unpredictability. You might remember interactions where someone pulled back slightly and the moment felt confusing until the energy eventually returned on its own. Those experiences often reveal how important emotional stability is during conversations that don't follow a perfectly smooth path. If you think back to moments where the energy between you and a woman cooled briefly and then returned after you stayed calm, you probably recognize how subtle those tests can be. And if you've ever experienced a situation where remaining relaxed during an awkward moment seemed to restore the conversation naturally, share that story in the comments. Many people begin noticing these patterns once they realize how often attraction observes reactions to uncertainty. Chapter 4. There's a moment that happens in conversations where the room gets a little quieter without anyone saying a word about it. You might be standing there talking to her, the interaction has been moving easily. And then she says something that lightly pokes at your ego. Not aggressively, not disrespectfully, just enough to see what happens next. Something like teasing you about your confidence, questioning something you said earlier, or joking about whether you're actually as bold as you seem. The tone of it usually sounds playful on the surface, but the reaction that follows matters more than the comment itself. A lot of men take that moment personally. They start defending themselves immediately. Their tone shifts, their posture tightens slightly. You can almost see the internal reaction happening in real time because suddenly they're explaining themselves instead of simply continuing the interaction. And the funny thing is, most women aren't even paying attention to the explanation. They're watching the reaction. You've probably seen this before if you've ever watched conversations between people carefully. One small joke or comment can change the entire energy of the interaction depending on how the other person handles it. If the man laughs and keeps his composure, the moment dissolves instantly. The conversation keeps flowing. The playful tension stays light. If the man becomes defensive, the interaction starts feeling heavier than it was supposed to be. The conversation becomes about proving something instead of simply enjoying the moment. Women notice that shift more than most men realize. Emotional reactions reveal more about a person than anything they say about themselves. Someone can claim they're confident, calm, or unbothered by pressure, but the truth becomes obvious when a small challenge appears in the interaction. That's why these little tests show up so often in conversations. They reveal stability. And you might be thinking back right now to a moment where a woman teased you about something, and your instinct was to immediately correct her or explain yourself. Most men do that automatically because the ego wants to protect itself. But the strange part is that the playful challenge usually disappears the moment you stop treating it like a threat. When a man stays relaxed in those situations, the interaction often becomes more fun rather than tense. The teasing becomes part of the chemistry, instead of turning into an argument about who's right. A man once described a situation that made this very clear to him. He had been talking to a woman at a small gathering, and the conversation had been light and comfortable for most of the night. They joked about random topics, talked about travel, music, and different life experiences. At one point she looked at him and said something half teasing, half curious. She said he seemed like the type of guy who probably talks a lot but doesn't follow through on things. Now that comment could easily trigger someone's ego. He could have started explaining his accomplishments. He could have told her all the things he had actually finished. He could have taken the comment seriously and tried to prove that she was wrong. Instead, he laughed. He looked at her and said something playful about how she would have to stick around long enough to find out. Then he continued the conversation as if the comment had never created tension at all. The energy stayed light. The interaction stayed fun. Later, he realized that the moment had revealed something important about how women observe reactions. The comment itself didn't matter. The reaction to it did. Women often pay attention to how a man handles playful pressure. The ability to stay relaxed during those moments communicates confidence more clearly than any self-description ever could. And if you really think about it, the same thing happens in other areas of life too. When someone becomes defensive over small comments, it signals insecurity whether they intend it or not. When someone stays calm and keeps the conversation moving naturally, it communicates stability without needing to say a word about it. Those reactions are difficult to fake because they happen instinctively. That's why these tests often appear during moments when the interaction feels relaxed. The woman isn't looking for a rehearsed answer. She's observing the man's natural reaction when his ego gets nudged slightly. If he stays composed, the interaction becomes more playful and engaging. If he becomes defensive, the moment feels heavier than it was meant to be. And once you start recognizing these moments, you begin seeing them everywhere. You notice how often conversations include small, playful challenges. You notice how some men handle them effortlessly, while others immediately shift into explanation mode, and the difference in how those interactions feel afterward becomes obvious. Think about the last time someone teased you lightly in a conversation. Not in a disrespectful way, just enough to see how you would respond. Did the moment feel playful, or did it suddenly feel like something needed to be defended? Those tiny reactions shape how people perceive you more than long explanations ever will. And if you've ever experienced a moment where you stayed relaxed during a playful challenge and noticed the interaction actually became more fun afterward, drop a comment about it. A lot of men begin recognizing how common these subtle tests are once they start paying attention to them. Chapter 5. The strange thing about these moments is that most men only realize what was happening long after the interaction is over. They'll replay the conversation later in their mind, thinking about the parts that felt slightly off or confusing, and slowly the pattern starts to reveal itself. Not because someone explained it to them, because the memory starts making sense once you step away from the emotion of the moment. You might remember a conversation where a woman questioned you, teased you, went quiet for a second, or shifted the tone slightly. At the time it felt random, maybe even frustrating. But later you realized she was simply watching how you handled yourself in small moments of pressure or uncertainty. And the truth is, these moments show up in ways that are so subtle, most men never even notice them happening. A woman might ask you a question about your plans for the future, and listen carefully to how you answer. Not just the words you say, but the certainty behind them. She might bring up something you said earlier and challenge it slightly, just enough to see whether you stand on what you said or whether you start adjusting your position to make the conversation easier. She might suddenly pull back in the interaction and see whether you remain the same person you were 5 minutes ago or whether your energy becomes reactive. None of these things look like obvious tests while they're happening. They feel like normal conversation. But if you step back and observe human behavior for a while, you start realizing something interesting about attraction. People are constantly observing emotional stability without realizing they're doing it. It's the same reason people naturally trust individuals who stay calm when things around them become uncertain. That calmness communicates something powerful without requiring explanation. Women respond strongly to that quality because emotional steadiness signals leadership and confidence in ways that words cannot replicate. And once you start recognizing that pattern, a lot of past experiences suddenly start making sense. You remember moments where a woman challenged you lightly and the interaction improved when you stayed relaxed. You remember moments where you felt the urge to defend yourself and later realized the conversation felt heavier afterward. You start seeing how often attraction reveals itself through reactions rather than declarations. A woman doesn't need to say she's evaluating you for that process to happen. It happens naturally because human beings are wired to observe behavior under pressure. If someone remains calm and grounded, the interaction tends to feel safe and engaging. If someone becomes reactive, the energy shifts quickly. That's why many men get confused when they try to explain themselves more during interactions. They think attraction is about saying the right things, when in reality it's often about how you behave when the moment becomes unpredictable. Words can be rehearsed. Reactions are usually honest, and the more you start paying attention to those reactions, the more you realize how many conversations are quietly revealing the same patterns. You might think back to a situation where a woman challenged you in a playful way, and the interaction became more interesting after you handled it calmly. Or maybe you remember a moment where the energy between you shifted suddenly, and you realized later that your reaction had shaped the rest of the interaction. Those moments teach more about attraction than any list of techniques ever could. Human chemistry often grows from emotional stability rather than perfectly crafted responses. The man who remains the same person regardless of small challenges communicates something that doesn't require explanation. His presence feels grounded. His reactions feel natural. The conversation flows without needing constant adjustments. Women notice that more than most men realize. And if you've been watching this video and recognizing moments from your own experiences, you're already seeing how common these patterns are. The moment you start observing conversations with this awareness, the small tests become easier to recognize. You begin noticing how often people reveal their character through reactions rather than words. And if this video made you think about interactions you've had before, go ahead and like the video so more people can find it. These kinds of conversations tend to help men notice patterns they were experiencing all along without realizing it. Share it with a friend too. If someone you know has ever been confused about why certain interactions with women felt easy while others suddenly became tense for reasons they couldn't explain. Sometimes, seeing the pattern once changes how you understand every conversation that comes after.